different decks are slanted in different ways, and they tend to have different artwork, different energies, and they work much better for different types of questions. For example, the side cards are lovely, but they're a rather modern deck. They're perfect for reading about real-time problems like jobs, career, again, boyfriends, that kind of thing. And the Psychic Tarot deck, which I really like, is very similar, but it's a much larger deck. It's also modern with beautiful pictures on it, but it's got 7 chakra cards in it. It's not a classic tarot, and it's really good for like spiritual path readings if somebody wants to know, like, or if they want to know about their past lives or their karma. Those become more choices, and they're just more. I call them cosmic. I know it sounds kind of hippie, but they're a very cosmic set of cards, and I use them for a lot of the more complex readings. Also, they have like 4 or 5 different cards for different types of love affairs or love, which there's only one card in the side card deck. So if someone's got an intricate question about their soulmate, that may be a better deck to use. Animal decks are really good for pet readings. They're also good for people wanting to look for their power animal or working with the energy of a particular animal or ally. Most decks can be used for spirit guides or information from the parted or information from spirit, but again, some work better than others for particular questions. Now, the traditional tarot is a more rigid system, and it's got really rigid answers, except, again, good readers can use it as a focus as well, but it's very good for very structured readings, and it's also good for when you want to get some distance. Because the old-fashioned illustrations actually create a sort of distance for you and the client, which sometimes you may need, as opposed to the more modern oracular decks that really pull you in to the card, but may sometimes be distracting. Different types of spreads definitely make a difference. I generally use for full readings, it's a variant of an old-fashioned style called the Celtic Cross that my first card teacher in Mississippi showed me, and it works really well for full general readings, but if I have a tighter question, I may use 1 card, 3 cards, 7 cards. There's also a way that you can, like, if a person has 2 questions, they have 2 possibilities. They can move to Denver or they can move to Atlanta, but they can't do both. I'll do 2 different complete readings for them, or 2 different 7 cards, but they won't tell me which way is which. And that way I don't know when I can't influence it, but they tell me afterwards usually because I like to know. But they get the energies around each move so they can have a better information on making a decision which one is better for them. And whether we did a 7-card reading or a full reading would depend on the situation and how much information they needed.
And how about with runes? When do you use or recommend them?
They work really well because they tend to be like powers like ice and fire and different things like that, birch tree. They work very well with traditional questions that we think they were probably used for, or at least we know the Doors divination of various types was used for, which was like predicting the weather, so weather changes, the harvest, earth changes like volcanoes. There's a rune that's basically the need fire. So when things are really, if things are desperate or you really need to know something, they're very good. Possible economic problems are good for readings if you want, if there's going to be a war. We tend to ask questions on New Year's like, what is the situations we're most likely facing in the new year? So like, where will things be coming from? Will it be a solar problem, or will it be maybe economic? Or this year we got floods. There's a rune basically that signifies flooding, and we got that, which we were expecting ice and snow, and we got floods instead. So you never know what you're going to come up with. They're also good for some spiritual path readings, and I've actually used them sometimes helping people find their animal spirits, because again, they're very traditional things, and there are some animals, though definitely not all, but there's some Northern European animals that are connected with them. I like to use runes for the great and hard to know questions like climate change or a pending war. So that's basically what they're best for, I think.
As a hypothetical question, let's say someone asked you the same questions as he would ask your husband. Would the answers tend to be similar, assuming you hadn't talked about it, right?
Very often, though we read runes very differently, interestingly enough. As he says, I read runes more like I read cards. I read the imagery from them. And often, one thing he noticed, he wanted me to start reading them because even before I was seriously studying them, I would pick up things from the rune the way I would pick it up from the cards. Now I'm trying to get all of the serious background information and learn it by heart as well, so I have that to influence. But interestingly enough, sometimes we do come up with very similar answers, but we do it in a roundabout way, different ways.
Okay. Thanks. Next up is Easy.
Hello, Melody. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Great. Just a thought came with Plains runes questions. Do different sections of the country or the world are they more inclined to do runes versus cards? I.e., is Ireland more runes interest, or is it more cards interest, or is there a difference? Do you notice people tending towards one or the other?
In general, that's a really good question. And in general, people tend towards cards in most places. The reason being, or if they want to know about, if they're asking about runes, like in Ireland, they'll ask you if you can do Om, which is sometimes mispronounced Agam, because there's a whole, I guess, metaphysical bookshop sets of supposedly Om runes, which historically, again, probably never existed, but people believe they do, and there was a system of Celtic trees, and these often get called the Celtic runes, and people here do use them, and they're quite popular. Again, even if they were invented in 1975, it doesn't really matter, because if they work for people as a focus, they're working. But people honestly believe that they're working an ancient old system, which they probably aren't. But again, the trees and the Om figures are real. They definitely are very ancient. So they're just taking an ancient technique, but they would call those the runes. What I'm referring to is the runes, or what my husband says properly, rune staves, are a specifically Germanic Norse technique, which were made popular in the States by somebody in the 1970s who, again, wrote a book where a certain amount of it is, shall we say, kind of not historically accurate, but it got certain people interested in them, and people have studied them. But by and large, I find most people are much more aware of cards in both places. Now, if you were to go to China or the Orient or even Chinatown, you'd probably get a lot more people interested in the I Ching or one of the Eastern methods of divination. But I would say cards most places, both in and it goes in cycles, because like in the 1980s when I lived in Denver, channeling was a really big thing, and people would have parties almost in their living rooms and have invited channeler, and they would bring forth an entity or supposedly a deity or spirit, and they would use their voice and talk to them. Very similar to old-fashioned mediumship. In the 19th century, spiritualism in mediumship was very, very popular and was used in very much the same way. And it never completely went away. But I'd say more people are interested. I think a lot of people find cards the same way I do. It's a very safe way to approach the unknown. You're not likely to get in a whole lot of trouble with them.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
One more question, if I could, please.
Sure.
The card of the day. The card of the days have been fascinating since you started doing that, and particularly now I'm expecting the same card to come up. So when it doesn't happen, I'm always shocked. And did you expect that did you have any expectations when you started doing the card of the day? And what is the question you ask before you do the card of the day?
Let me answer that one first. The first thing I do when I do card of the day is I do a little bit of a breathing exercise for a couple of seconds, and then because I am mainly a follower of the Norse traditions, I ask Freya, who is the goddess who is in charge of divination, one of the goddesses in charge of divination, she wears a falcon cloak, and I ask her kind of to put her falcon cloak around me and give me guidance. Now, anybody doing something like this, you could use whatever spiritual path you find comfortable, but basically I ask for divine guidance in doing it. Okay, and then the question I normally ask is, what is the most important energy for the next 24 hours for either the world or the Western Hemisphere? And 90% of the time, the mental image I have, I think in pictures a lot, is of a map of the globe with North America and Europe in front. And I repeat this several times a week, so because I know if I were living in Australia or living in Japan, I would have a different focus. Now, sometimes I pick things up, like there was been a few times that I've just overwhelmingly known that something was about Fukushima or some other part of the world, and that will stand out very clearly. But most of the time, I want to know what the main energy is, or energies that are really going to be at play in the next 24 to 48 hours. Oh, and sorry, and as for the repeat, sorry, I almost forgot about that. The repeat, I did not know they would repeat as much as they have. There are actually 40 cards in the deck. My original expectation for starting the card of the day was just to show off a little mini reading for my reading business. And then it got to be so interesting and so intense, and I felt so involved in particularly connecting the cards and the energies to world events that it just sort of took off on a life of its own. I'm not shocked by the fact that they come up the same, because what really does surprise even me sometimes, although it repeatedly happens, is in a personal reading for a client, you'll ask, the same cards will show up 4 or 5 times. Even if we change decks to completely different decks, we use the Psychic Tarot and the Psy cards and maybe even the runes, and we're getting the same energies coming up, and even the client can see it, you know. And it's not even that we're asking identical questions, but it's just those are the main energies in their life right now. And going back to the old radio show, those cards are those what I called the cards of the week at that point, because I was doing a weekly show. It was obvious that the same energies, like say the moon or work or the Lover's card, seem to be influencing nearly everybody in a particular way. What has surprised me about the card of the day is the consistency with particularly the worldwide readings. But again, if we look at the current headlines for I started this like in August, I went back and looked it up. The major stories have been about economics and conflict, and I think the cards are just picking that up. It'll be interesting to see if we get beyond this particular rocky period with economics, if they'll change again. Because there are, as I tell my clients, there are other cards in this deck. They're just not showing up. And even if I change decks, or if I change the way I shuffle them, or I have other people pick them, they don't change.
They don't. It's just fascinating. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Easy. Melody, we're going to move on to the topic of the unseen world, and Uranus Rising has a question next.
Hi, Melody. I found the first chapter of your book, Beginner's Guide to the Unseen World, very informative. You have a real gift for staying grounded while exploring and explaining the unseen world. Would you share with us what this book is about, what you mean by the unseen world, and what you hope to offer readers, and, of course, when it might be available, because I want to get my hands on it.
Okay. Well, for to answer the availability question first, I started it about 5 years ago and then put it aside and have picked it back up again. And my husband is helping me with it. He's got some other projects. He's a professional writer, among other things. And we hope to get it out in the spring if we can. Part of the issue is we're trying to decide if we want to break it down, because the first chapter is 17 pages long, the one that people can get for free by going to my website and downloading. That's still an only partially edited version, so yes, I know there are some – it's not necessarily the way it's finally going to be, but you can get a sense of what the book will be like by going there. So we may put it out as one large book or several smaller ones, but hopefully in the spring for the first installment. Basically what it is, it's an introduction to the most common questions and situations that I've noticed in about 30 years of working with people, particularly the special problems that come in when people first start exploring or the unseen world, and or, as I say in the book, the unseen world comes looking for them.